The streets of Denver, Colorado, were alive with the usual evening bustle. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of gold and lavender, casting long shadows over the cracked sidewalks. Streetlights flickered to life, their orange glow reflecting off wet pavement as the city settled into the quiet hum of twilight. Benny, a scruffy, wiry-haired stray, padded through an alleyway, his paws silent against the cool ground. His ribs were visible beneath his matted fur, and a small scar cut through his right ear, evidence of the hardships he had endured. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but he had grown used to it. He had survived by his wits alone, scouring the streets for scraps, avoiding cruel hands, and seeking out the kindness of strangers when he could. Maddie Carter was one of those rare souls who saw strays not as nuisances but as creatures deserving of love. At 22, she was a veterinary student balancing her studies with a part-time job at an animal clinic. Every evening, on her way home, she carried a small bag of leftovers, bits of chicken, stale bread, or cheese, anything she could spare for the animals who had no homes. That evening, as she strolled past a row of dumpsters, she spotted Benny rummaging through a pile of discarded food containers. His tail was low, his body tense, ready to bolt at any sudden movement. "Hey there, buddy," she murmured, kneeling a few feet away. She reached into her bag and pulled out a bone wrapped with bits of meat. "Hungry?" Benny froze, his amber eyes flickering between Maddie and the food. He sniffed the air cautiously, ears twitching. Maddie remained still, careful not to startle him. After a long hesitation, Benny trotted forward, but instead of devouring the bone, he carefully took it in his mouth and turned away. Maddie frowned. Strays never hesitated to eat when given food, especially one as lean as Benny. But he wasn't interested. Instead, he moved with purpose, his thin legs carrying him through the alleyway. Curiosity sparked inside Maddie. She had seen strays hoard food before, but Benny's behavior felt different. He wasn't hiding it, he was delivering it. Without thinking, she followed him. Benny led her through the dimly lit streets, pausing every few moments to check if he was being watched. He trotted past a row of parked cars, then slipped through a gap in a rusted fence. Maddie stayed back, moving carefully, her heart pounding. Finally, Benny stopped at a storm drain, one of the large metal grates embedded in the sidewalk. He dropped the bone and nudged it through the gaps, his ears perked as if waiting for a response. Maddie sucked in a breath. Who, or what, was he feeding? Maddie crouched a few feet away, watching in silence as Benny pushed the bone further through the metal grate. His tail wagged slightly, not in excitement, but in quiet anticipation. Something inside that drain mattered to him. She leaned forward, trying to see through the gaps, but the darkness swallowed everything beyond the first few inches. A faint sound reached her ears, a soft rustling, almost like tiny movements scraping against the concrete. Maddie's breath hitched. Something was alive down there. Benny whined and nudged the grate with his nose before stepping back, waiting. Maddie had spent years around animals, and she had seen behaviors of all kinds. But this was different. This wasn't a dog stashing food for later or hiding it from bigger animals. Benny was caring for something. Over the next few days, Maddie observed him from a distance. Every evening, he returned to the storm drain, always carrying scraps in his mouth. If she didn't see him during the day, she could count on spotting him there at night, faithfully delivering food. Her curiosity grew stronger. What was Benny feeding? A family of rats? A sick animal? The thought nagged at her, but she hesitated to intervene too soon. She didn't want to scare him away. Then, on the third night, the rain came. The first droplets tapped softly against the pavement, turning into a steady downpour within minutes. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Maddie tightened her jacket as she hurried down the sidewalk. She had almost convinced herself to go straight home until she saw Benny. He was sitting by the storm drain, his body soaked, ears flat against his head. But he didn't leave. He didn't seek shelter. Instead, he barked, a sharp, urgent sound that sent a chill down Maddie's spine. Something was wrong. Maddie ran to the grate and dropped to her knees. The rain made it hard to see, but as she leaned in closer, a sound reached her ears. A faint, pitiful cry. A kitten's cry. Her breath caught in her throat. There were kittens down there. Maddie's hands trembled as she gripped the bars of the grate, trying to peer into the darkness. The rainwater was beginning to pool on the street, small streams rushing toward the drain. If the downpour continued, the storm drain would flood. And the kittens wouldn't stand a chance. Panic surged through her. She had to get them out, but how? The metal grate was bolted in place, too heavy for her to lift alone. She grabbed her phone and dialed the only person she could think of who might help. "Lucas," she said, her voice shaking, "I need you. Right now." Benny barked again, pacing anxiously beside her as if he understood the urgency. Maddie gritted her teeth, her heart pounding. She had no idea what they were about to find, but she knew one thing for certain. There was no way she was leaving without those kittens. The rain pounded against Maddie's back as she huddled near the storm drain, her fingers gripping the metal bars, knuckles turning white. Benny whined beside her, pacing back and forth, his tail stiff, ears perked. The soft cries from below were growing weaker, barely audible over the rush of rainwater spilling into the drain. "Come on, Lucas, pick up." Maddie's heart raced as the phone rang in her hand. Finally, a click. "Carter? What's going on?" Lucas Grant's voice was groggy, laced with exhaustion. "Lucas, I need your help. It's an emergency." The rustling of sheets told her she had just woken him. "Where are you?" "Near 8th and Franklin, by the old bookstore." She swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady. "There are kittens trapped in a storm drain. Benny's been feeding them for days. If we don't get them out now, they'll drown." Lucas was silent for a second. Then she heard movement, a bed creaking, the shuffle of fabric. "I'm on my way. Hang tight." Maddie exhaled, glancing at Benny, who had stopped pacing and was now staring at her, as if sensing that help was on the way. 10 agonizing minutes later, Lucas' truck came skidding around the corner. The headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the soaked pavement. He barely put the vehicle in park before jumping out, his firefighter's jacket pulled over his head for some protection against the downpour. "Where?" he demanded. Maddie pointed at the drain. Lucas crouched beside her, pulling out his heavy-duty flashlight. The beam pierced through the grate, revealing the dark, wet space below. And there they were. 5 tiny kittens huddled together against the curve of the drain's wall, their fur damp, their bodies trembling violently. Lucas let out a slow breath. "Damn. They won't last long." Maddie felt a lump form in her throat. "We have to get them out." Lucas tested the grate, pulling at the rusted metal. It didn't budge. "These things are bolted down to keep people from messing with the system." He gritted his teeth. "We need tools. I have a crowbar in my truck," but he stopped as Benny suddenly let out a sharp bark. Maddie turned. Benny's eyes were locked onto the drain, his entire body tense. Then she saw it. The water level was rising. Fast. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Lucas, we don't have time." Lucas bolted for his truck while Maddie stayed by the grate, her pulse pounding in her ears. She reached her hand through, stretching her fingers as far as she could, but the kittens were too deep inside. "Hurry," she shouted. Lucas ran back, crowbar in hand. "Move." Maddie scrambled to the side as he jammed the metal tool into the edge of the grate. With a grunt, he pushed down, muscles straining. The rusted bolts groaned in protest, but they held firm. Maddie's stomach twisted. "It's not working." "Give me a sec." Lucas readjusted his grip and shoved harder. This time, with a screeching crack, one side of the grate popped loose. He shifted positions, using all his strength to pry it free. Finally, with a metallic clang, the grate gave way. Maddie didn't hesitate. She dropped onto her stomach and reached down into the drain. "Come here, babies," she murmured, her fingers brushing against damp fur. The kittens were terrified, pressing themselves against the cold, wet surface. Maddie managed to grab one, a tiny black and white fur ball, lifting it out and cradling it against her chest. "One down," she gasped, handing the kitten to Lucas. He wrapped it in his jacket before she turned back for another. She reached again, straining, feeling her nails scrape against concrete. 2 more kittens. She scooped them up together, their tiny bodies shivering against her palms. "You're doing great," Lucas encouraged, his hands steady as he took them. "Just 2 more." Maddie stretched deeper into the drain, feeling the water rush against her arm. She could see the last 2 kittens, one gray, one orange, pressed against the curve of the pipe. They were barely moving. Panic surged inside her. "No, no, no. Come on." She inched forward, gripping the edges of the drain for support. Her fingertips brushed the gray kitten's fur. With a careful sweep, she scooped it up and handed it to Lucas. "One more." Her voice cracked. She turned her attention to the last kitten, the tiniest of them all. Its body was limp, its head lolling to the side. Her breath caught. "It's not moving." "Lucas." "I see it," he said grimly. Maddie reached as far as she could, her fingertips barely grazing the kitten's damp fur. "Just a little more." Suddenly, Benny moved. Without hesitation, he jumped down into the storm drain. "Benny!" Maddie yelped. Lucas cursed. What the hell is he doing? But Benny wasn't struggling. He moved with intention, stepping carefully through the rising water. Reaching the tiny orange kitten, he gently took it in his mouth, not biting, not hurting, just cradling it delicately. Maddie's heart nearly stopped. "Oh my God." Benny turned toward them, stepping closer. Maddie reached down, wrapping her fingers around the kitten's frail body as Benny released it into her hands. She cradled it against her chest, its fur damp and cold. "I got you," she whispered, even as she feared it might be too late. Lucas helped her scramble back to her feet. The rain still poured around them, but Maddie hardly noticed. "Let's get them to the clinic," she said, determination setting her jaw. "Now." Lucas nodded, already moving toward the truck. As she climbed in, clutching the fragile kitten to her chest, she cast a glance at Benny. He stood by the now empty storm drain, his wet fur sticking to his frail body, his amber eyes locked onto hers. Maddie swallowed past the lump in her throat. He had saved them. And for the first time, she realized Benny wasn't just a stray. He was a hero. Maddie sat in the passenger seat of Lucas's truck, cradling the smallest kitten against her chest, willing warmth back into its tiny body. The other 4 kittens, wrapped in Lucas's firefighter jacket, lay on the seat between them, huddled together for warmth. Their fragile bodies trembled, their breathing shallow. The urgency clawed at Maddie's chest like an invisible hand squeezing her ribs. "Drive faster," she whispered. Lucas tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. "I'm already pushing it." The rain continued to pour outside, the windshield wipers barely able to keep up. The storm had turned the streets into rivers, making every turn slick, every stop unpredictable. Maddie barely noticed, her whole world had shrunk down to the small, damp bodies in her arms. Beside her, Benny sat stiffly, his wet fur dripping onto the truck floor, his amber eyes locked onto the kittens. He hadn't stopped watching them since they left the storm drain. Maddie reached over with one hand and ran her fingers through his damp fur. "You saved them," she whispered. "You knew they were down there this whole time." Benny blinked at her, but his body language said everything. He wasn't leaving them now. Lucas took a sharp turn, the tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. He gritted his teeth. "We're almost there." The veterinary clinic where Maddie interned was only 5 minutes away, but it felt like a lifetime. She looked down at the orange kitten Benny had carried out of the storm drain. It was barely breathing. Its tiny body was limp, its fur clinging to its delicate frame. Maddie felt a sharp pang of fear stab through her chest. "Please hold on. Just a little longer." As soon as Lucas pulled up to the clinic, Maddie was already pushing the door open. "Help!" she shouted, bursting through the entrance. The harsh fluorescent lights stung her eyes, but she didn't stop. Dr. Collins, the head veterinarian, turned from the desk, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm in an instant. "Maddie?" His eyes darted to the bundle in her arms. "What happened?" "No time," Maddie gasped, placing the smallest kitten on the examination table as gently as she could. They were trapped in a storm drain. They're freezing, barely breathing. We need to warm them up now. Lucas followed in with the other 4 kittens bundled in his jacket. Dr. Collins didn't hesitate. He snapped his fingers at the 2 vet techs in the room. "Get heat pads and warm blankets. I need fluids, stat." The clinic burst into motion. Maddie hovered near the table, her pulse hammering as one of the vet techs wrapped a kitten in a soft towel and placed it against a heating pad. The kittens barely stirred. Too weak. Too cold. Maddie clenched her fists. They had to make it. Dr. Collins examined the smallest kitten, the orange one Benny had saved. His mouth was pressed into a tight line, his fingers gentle but firm as he checked for vital signs. "This little guy's in critical condition," he muttered. "Severe hypothermia." Maddie bit her lips so hard she tasted blood. "Can we save him?" Dr. Collins met her eyes, his expression grim. "We're going to try." She watched as he inserted a tiny 4 into the kitten's fragile leg. Maddie held her breath as a warm saline solution began to drip into its tiny veins. Behind her, Benny sat quietly, watching. His body was rigid, his ears flicking every time one of the kittens let out the faintest whimper. Maddie reached down and scratched behind his ears. "You don't have to stay," she murmured. "You can rest now." But Benny didn't move. Lucas sighed and ran a hand through his damp hair. "This dog's got more patience than anyone I know." Maddie chuckled weakly. "Yeah. And more heart." The minutes stretched into an hour. The clinic was quiet except for the soft beeping of machines and the occasional murmur of the vet techs. Maddie stayed glued to the kittens, gently rubbing warmth into their tiny bodies, whispering encouragement. "Come on, little ones. Stay with me." Then, finally, a small, weak meow filled the room. Maddie gasped. Her eyes snapped to the smallest kitten, the orange one. Its tiny mouth had opened, its head wobbling slightly. Dr. Collins nodded approvingly. "That's a good sign." Maddie let out a shaky breath. She hadn't realized she'd been holding it. The other kittens were stirring too, curling into the warmth of the blankets, their shivering less violent than before. The warmth, the fluids, and sheer willpower were bringing them back. Benny let out a soft whine, stepping closer. He sniffed at the kittens, his nose barely brushing against the bundle of fur. "They're okay," Maddie whispered. "You did it, Benny." Benny sat down with a quiet huff, as if only now allowing himself to relax. Maddie smiled and placed a gentle hand on his head. Dr. Collins turned to her, crossing his arms. "You did good, Maddie." She shook her head. Benny did. He was the one feeding them. He wouldn't leave them. Dr. Collins glanced at the stray dog, his brows furrowing. He fed them? Even when he was starving himself? Maddie nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. He saved their lives. Dr. Collins let out a breath, shaking his head in wonder. That's rare. That kind of loyalty. He patted Maddie on the shoulder. These kittens are lucky. So is Benny, for finding you. Maddie looked down at Benny, watching as he lay beside the kittens, his body curled protectively around the base of the table, as if standing guard. Something inside her shifted. What would happen to Benny now? The thought hit her like a brick. She had been so focused on saving the kittens, she hadn't considered what came next for him. He had no home. No collar. No one looking for him. Except her. Maddie bit her lip. Was she ready for this? To take him in? Lucas must have sensed her thoughts because he nudged her elbow. "You already know the answer." Maddie sighed. "Do I?" Lucas smirked. "Come on. Look at him. Hasn't he already chosen you?" Maddie glanced down at Benny. The scruffy dog lifted his head, his amber eyes locking onto hers. And in that moment, she knew. She couldn't let him go. She crouched down, stroking his wet fur. "All right, Benny," she whispered. "I guess you're coming home with me." Benny's tail thumped once. Just once. But that was enough. The rain had stopped by the time Maddie stepped out of the clinic, the air thick with the scent of damp pavement and fresh earth. The city was quiet, the usual evening bustle subdued by the passing storm. Beside her, Benny padded along, his fur still damp but his posture lighter, as if he, too, had finally allowed himself to breathe. The kittens were safe. Warm. Alive. Now, there was only one question left: what about Benny? Maddie had always assumed he was just another stray, another forgotten soul wandering the streets like so many others. But the way he had cared for those kittens, sacrificing his own food, standing guard over them, that wasn't just survival instinct. That was devotion. And dogs like that didn't come from nowhere. "Lucas," she said suddenly, turning to him as they neared his truck. "I need to know where Benny came from." Lucas arched a brow. "You planning on giving him back to someone?" Maddie glanced down at Benny, who was sitting patiently at her feet, his tail sweeping against the pavement. The idea of letting him go sent a pang through her chest. "No," she admitted. I need to know. He deserves that." Lucas nodded. "I know someone at the shelter. If he's ever been brought in, they'll have records." Maddie exhaled. "Let's go." The Denver animal shelter was quiet, the usual barking and whining of caged dogs muted as the staff closed up for the night. Maddie walked in with Benny at her side, Lucas following behind. A woman at the front desk glanced up, recognition flashing in her eyes. "Maddie Carter?" she asked, surprised. Maddie nodded. "Hey, Samantha." Samantha, one of the senior shelter workers, leaned forward. "What brings you in?" Maddie hesitated, then gestured to Benny. "I need to know if he's been here before. If he was ever picked up, brought in, or," she swallowed, "if someone's looking for him." Samantha frowned, her gaze flickering to Benny. "I swear I've seen him before." She tapped at the computer, scrolling through records. The screen's glow reflected in her tired eyes. A few seconds later, she inhaled sharply. "Here he is." Maddie felt her breath catch. "What does it say?" Samantha's lips pressed into a thin line. "Benny was brought in 2 years ago. His owner abandoned him." Maddie's stomach twisted. She dropped her gaze to Benny, who sat obediently at her feet, unaware of the weight of the words that had just been spoken. "Why?" Maddie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samantha sighed. "Says here he was part of a family. A couple and their son. They had him since he was a puppy, but when they moved out of state, they left him behind." Maddie clenched her fists. "They just left?" Samantha nodded. "They didn't even drop him off at a shelter. A neighbor saw him wandering the streets alone, looking for them. Animal control picked him up." Maddie's chest ached. She imagined it, a loyal dog, standing outside his home, waiting for the people he loved to come back. But they never did. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. Why wasn't he adopted? Samantha hesitated. He didn't do well in the shelter. Some dogs adjust, but Benny? He shut down. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't interact. He spent weeks just curled up in the corner of his kennel. People looked at him, but no one wanted a dog that didn't wag his tail or show excitement. Maddie swallowed the lump in her throat. He had given up. Samantha continued. Eventually, he escaped. Slipped right through the fencing one night. We tried to find him, but he disappeared. Maddie felt a lump form in her throat. He had survived alone for 2 years. But he hadn't given up on love. Not really. Benny had chosen to care for those kittens, even when he had nothing. He had still chosen kindness. She crouched down, cupping Benny's face gently in her hands. His amber eyes met hers, soft and trusting. "You've been waiting for someone," she whispered. Benny didn't move. But his tail thumped once. Just once. Maddie turned back to Samantha. "No one else ever came looking for him?" Samantha shook her head. "Not a single person." Maddie exhaled, the decision settling in her bones. Then that was it. She looked at Benny again and smiled. "Well," she said softly, "he has someone now." Benny let out a quiet, contented huff and leaned into her touch. And just like that, he was home. Maddie sat on her couch, staring at the adoption papers in her lap. The clinic had already checked Benny for a microchip, nothing. He had no legal ties to anyone. No one had come searching for him in 2 years. Now, the choice was hers. Benny lay curled up at her feet, his body relaxed for the first time since she had met him. He had followed her home without hesitation, stepping inside as if he had belonged there all along. He had sniffed around the small apartment, wagged his tail at the sight of a warm blanket, and finally settled by the couch, as if he already knew this was home. Maddie ran a hand through her damp hair. What was stopping her? She had always loved animals, dedicated her life to helping them. Taking Benny in should have been the easiest decision in the world. But it wasn't. She exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. "You don't make things easy, do you?" Benny lifted his head, tilting it slightly at her tone. Maddie sighed. It wasn't that she didn't want him. It was that she was terrified of failing him. She was a veterinary student with an insane schedule. Between classes, her internship at the clinic, and late-night study sessions, she barely had time to take care of herself. What if Benny needed more than she could give? She chewed her lip. "You deserve someone who can be there for you. Always." Benny huffed softly and rested his chin on his paws, his amber eyes never leaving her. A gentle knock at the door made her jolt. She stood, peeking through the peephole before unlocking the door. Lucas. He leaned against the doorframe, a knowing smirk on his face. "I figured you'd be overthinking this." Maddie crossed her arms. "I'm not." "Please," Lucas scoffed, stepping inside. His gaze landed on Benny. "You're acting like there's a choice to be made." "There is a choice," she insisted. "What if I can't give him what he needs?" "What if?" Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Hasn't he already chosen you?" Maddie opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked down at Benny, who still hadn't moved, as if he was waiting for her to decide. Waiting, the way he had waited for his past owners to return. The difference was, Maddie wasn't going to leave him. Her chest tightened. Benny had been alone for so long. Not anymore. She grabbed the adoption papers and a pen from the coffee table. She didn't hesitate this time. With one final deep breath, she signed her name. It was done. Benny lifted his head as if sensing the change in the air. Maddie set the papers down, then knelt beside him. "Looks like you're stuck with me, buddy." For a second, Benny just stared. Then his tail thumped against the floor. Once, twice, then faster, until his entire body wiggled with excitement. Maddie let out a laugh, wrapping her arms around his scruffy neck. Yeah, I know. It took me long enough." Lucas chuckled. "Told you." Maddie rolled her eyes, but couldn't stop smiling. Benny wasn't just another stray anymore. He was home. Benny adjusted to life indoors as if he had been waiting for it his whole life. The first few nights, he was cautious, sleeping near the door, ears twitching at every sound. Maddie had given him a soft dog bed, but he ignored it, choosing instead to curl up on the floor beside her couch. By the end of the first week, that changed. One morning, Maddie woke up to find Benny sprawled out on the couch, head resting on a pillow as if he had lived there forever. She blinked, then shook her head with a laugh. "Comfortable," she teased, scratching behind his ears. Benny wagged his tail, his eyes half closed in contentment. Maddie settled into a routine with him: morning walks before class, belly rubs when she got home, late-night study sessions where Benny sat beside her, occasionally nudging her when she had been reading for too long. She noticed the little things about him: the way his tail wagged when she came through the door, the way he always checked on the kittens in their playpen before settling down for the night, as if still watching over them. She also noticed how he still hesitated when she left for work. Every time she grabbed her bag and put on her shoes, Benny would sit near the door, watching her carefully, as if preparing himself for the possibility that she wouldn't come back. It broke her heart. One evening, as she knelt in front of him, she placed her hands on either side of his face and whispered, "I'm always coming back, Benny. I promise." His tail thumped once, but the doubt in his eyes didn't disappear completely. It would take time. One day, while running errands, Maddie stopped by a pet store and bought Benny a new collar. Unlike the faded, tattered rope he had once worn, this one was sturdy, warm brown leather with a silver tag that gleamed under the store lights. She had his name engraved on the front. And on the back, she wrote, "If lost, call Maddie. Benny belongs to me." When she buckled it around his neck, Benny sniffed at it, then looked up at her. His tail wagged slowly, then faster, until he let out a happy huff and licked her cheek. Maddie laughed. Yeah. I know. Took me long enough." Benny pressed his head against her chest, his tail still wagging. He wasn't a stray anymore. He was home. Months passed, and Benny became more than just a pet, he became family. The kittens had grown stronger, playful, and full of energy. Maddie found loving homes for 4 of them, but one, Fudge, the tiny orange furball that Benny had saved last, refused to leave his side. Wherever Benny went, Fudge followed, curling up against his paws, batting at his tail, or climbing onto his back for a nap. Maddie couldn't separate them. So, in the end, she didn't. Fudge stayed. Life settled into a steady rhythm, Maddie juggling work and school, Benny and Fudge turning her small apartment into a home filled with warmth and laughter. But one evening, while walking home from the clinic, Maddie saw something that made her stop in her tracks. In the same alley where she had first met Benny, a small, shivering dog huddled near a dumpster, its ribs showing, its eyes filled with fear. For a moment, Maddie just stood there, heart hammering. Then, before she could move, Benny did. Without hesitation, he walked up to the stray, his tail wagging slowly, his posture relaxed. He didn't bark or startle it, he simply sat down beside it. Patient. Gentle. Just like Maddie had done for him. The stray looked at Benny, its body tense with uncertainty. Then, after a long pause, it took a slow step forward. Maddie felt a lump rise in her throat. She crouched, extending her hand, just like she had done with Benny all those months ago. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're not alone." The stray hesitated, then inched closer, sniffing at her fingers. Benny wagged his tail, giving an approving huff, as if to say, "See? This is how kindness works." Maddie smiled, her heart full. She finally understood. Kindness isn't just something you give. It's something you pass on. And Benny had done exactly that. Maddie sat on her couch, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, watching as Benny and Fudge curled up together on the rug. The once abandoned dog and the tiny kitten he had saved were now inseparable. Fudge playfully swatted at Benny's ear, only to be pulled into a warm embrace by the big dog's paws. Benny sighed contentedly, letting the kitten nestle against his chest. Maddie smiled. They were home. Her small apartment, once a quiet space filled only with books and late-night studying, was now filled with life. She had once worried about whether she could take care of Benny, but in the end, he had taken care of her just as much. Every morning, he greeted her with an excited wag of his tail. Every night, he slept at the foot of her bed, keeping watch as if making sure she was safe. And Fudge? He was a little ball of chaos, climbing shelves, pouncing on Benny's tail, and curling up on Maddie's lap when she studied late into the night. She reached down and scratched behind Benny's ears. Not bad for a stray, huh? Benny looked up, his amber eyes warm and full of trust. His tail thumped once against the floor. Maddie leaned back, exhaling softly. She had set out to save Benny. But in the end, Benny had saved her too. Benny's story didn't end the day Maddie brought him home. One evening, on a whim, she shared his story online, the stray dog who had risked everything to save 5 tiny kittens, the way he had cared for them even when he was starving, and how, in the end, kindness had saved them all. She didn't expect much. But overnight, the post went viral. People from all over the country sent messages, some thanking her for saving Benny, others sharing how his story had inspired them to adopt, to help, to show kindness to the animals often overlooked. Shelters reached out, using Benny's story to encourage people to foster strays. Donations flooded into rescue centers. One act of kindness had sparked hundreds more. Maddie smiled as she watched Benny, now curled up on the couch with Fudge. He had no idea how many lives he had changed, how his story had turned into something bigger than himself. She reached down, running her fingers through his soft fur. "Because of you, so many lives were saved," she whispered. Benny's tail wagged, just once, as if he understood. He had once been a stray, forgotten by the world. Now, he was something more. A symbol of kindness. A reminder that even the smallest acts of love could change everything. And he was home. Forever.